There we go. So thank you everybody for joining us for this discussion of humanitarian well-being, especially on the individual side. In 2 weeks, we will be covering humanitarian well-being from a structural perspective. So today we'll be focusing more on the individual, but of course there is also a lot of overlap between those two. So I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists first, and then we will get started with the discussion. So I'll just go by who is where on my screen. So I'll start with Gabriela Hiremans, who holds a master's in social psychology and specializes in providing data-driven results to support HR initiatives and project management in the field of development and humanitarian aid. As the wellness officer at Insight Collaborative, she is supporting work examining the concept of moral injury and how this intersects with humanitarian workers' wellness. As a current Fulbright researcher examining motivational factors affecting humanitarian workers, she is contributing to bodies of research informing HR teams in diverse organisations in Turkey on best recruitment and retention strategies for humanitarian personnel. Next on my screen is Daniela. Daniela Orfali-Hot is from Chile. She is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist using the psychoanalytical approach. She works at a hospital and in private practice. In 2016, she worked for 3 months in Lesvos in Greece with the Boat Refugee Foundation as a field volunteer and psychosocial team manager at Moria and Karatepe refugee camps. In 2017, she worked from February to June in Lebanon with Salam LADC as a field volunteer and logistics coordinator. And then from October 2017 till January 2018, she worked as a psychologist in the Chilean Refugee Resettlement Program for Syrian refugees from Lebanon. Next, I've got Darren. Darren Abrahams is a singer, coach, trauma therapist, and trainer working internationally as a facilitator and project leader in the fields of personal, cultural, and community development. Darren is co-founder of The Human Hive, a CIC working with individuals and organizations to make a more welcoming and inclusive world. He is on the steering team and head of pastoral care for the Complete Freedom of Truth, an international youth-led project developing global youth citizenship through culture and the arts, and is a trainer and well-being advisor for Musicians Without Borders, where he trains musicians to use music for peace building. Darren is an expert at making people feel safe while bringing communities together to heal. And finally, Emily Wilson is a humanitarian aid worker and qualified educator who has been working in the refugee context in Greece for 4 years. After completing her master's degree in international humanitarian affairs, Emily took part in a year-long trauma training program, focusing on self-regulation, movement, the effects of trauma, and self-care practices within humanitarian aid. Emily is a yoga instructor, advisor of Project Alea in Athens, and field coordinator of Refugee for Refugees. So as I'm sure you can hear, we've got a really wonderful panel with a lot of expertise with us today. So we will be talking about individual humanitarian well-being. And if it's okay with all of you, we'll just get started. I've got some set questions that I'd like to ask the panel, but if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions, please do feel free to type them into the chat and I will relay them to the panel at an appropriate time. So for our panel, our first question is very simple. How would you define well-being and wellness? If it's okay with all of you, maybe we can, maybe you can each say a little something about how you feel about that, and then we can kind of discuss it more. Shall we go in the same order that I introduced you? So that will be you first, Gabriela.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Danielle. It's really exciting to be here discussing such a valuable topic. And it's great to meet you, Daniela, Emily, and Darren. So really simply, for me, wellness is taking care of yourself on a daily basis, making sure that you have the time to implement routines for yourself that foster growth and self-reflection, and basically making time for yoga, meditation, all of that. And then it's going to be a challenge, I think, in this webinar to not separate the individual and the collective, how those two different ways impact humanitarian wellness, because they're very interconnected, which I'm sure we'll get into more later. But I think a big part of wellness is also just being comfortable with the daily routine that you have, the people that you're interacting with at work, and making sure that you have the time to and the comfort level to ask for help and get that support from your work when you need it, to ask for the time to take care of yourself. That's definitely a big part of wellness. So I'll pass it on to whoever's next. I'm not sure who that was, but.
Thank you, Gabriella. Yes, it was Danny next.
Okay, yes. Hi, everyone. I think it's not such a simple question. I was thinking I will try to translate what Jaime Coloma, an amazing teacher and master of psychoanalysis here in Chile, that I know says. He says, life should be worth living. And it might sound simple or not, to put it that way. But when a person, for example, asks for psychological treatment, I can't say what is best for that person in particularly. But maybe if we understand mental health as living life with dignity, and experiencing that life is worth living, that's a good guide for me. I think it's not pretending that life doesn't imply any suffering, because we as humans are in conflict always, but being able to have some joy and to do what is meaningful for each one. Freud also has, I think, a good reference for mental health. He defines it as being able to love and to work. And work doesn't necessarily mean like traditional job. For some people, maybe it will be that, but for others, something else. So I think it's maybe about something about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I completely agree that that work is really important, even if it's not traditional paid work. You know, just some kind of fulfillment and purpose is crucial for well-being, certainly. Darren, what are your thoughts on this?
Hi, Daniel. Thank you, and great to meet all of the rest of the panelists as well. It's wonderful to be a part of this discussion with the three of you. I agree with both of what Gabriella and Daniela have already said, but I'm very entrenched in this discussion at the moment because I'm in the process of, I'm halfway through a 6-month pilot program, really looking at well-being for humanitarian aid workers and working with 12 organizations across the sector. And we've been defining well-being, wellness or well-being as we're calling it, as the intersection of 3 main things: safety, psychological, emotional, and physical safety; belonging, which is inclusion and ability to make satisfying relationships; and purpose, which is about meaningful work and contribution to something greater than yourself. So when we're looking at individuals and their place within organizations doing humanitarian work, we're looking at the intersection of those 3 things, and then layering over the top of that individual identity. What does your individual identity, whether it's cultural or linguistic or gender or sexuality or racial, how do those things intersect with your safety, your belonging, and your purpose within the context that you're working?
Thank you, Darren. That's really helpful. Emily, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, so I was having a good think about this question, and in the times that I've been working in the field, I've understood that, you know, I've seen wellness go up and down in myself and in different people, and I came to realize that sometimes some areas of wellness or some areas of your life might not be so well, and some might be very well. So when I thought about defining this question, I wanted to describe wellness as something that's very multi-dimensional. And I would say that it's also an active journey. It's something that's linked to, I think, your choices and intentions and the different things or activities that you take part in. I would describe wellness as something that we can be excited by working towards achieving. However, it's not often that we're able to achieve wellness in every area of our lives. And I think that sometimes sacrifices can be made. For example, in aspect of our, say, physical or emotional wellness, this would suffer due to pursuit of social wellness or spiritual wellness. For example, working towards purpose, as was just described, or this is in the humanitarian field, and often you might put this first before your physical or emotional wellness. I think wellness can be imbalanced, and I think that we have to work as a community to be really aware of this. Also, I wanted to say a big thank you, and I'm very excited to be here too. So, thank
Great.
you.
I'm delighted that you're all really enthusiastic about the discussion because it feels so important. I think we've been finding more and more of our colleagues and our friends in the sector over the course of the pandemic have been really struggling with their well-being and their mental health. So many more people have been leaving the sector either temporarily or permanently, just because there's so much going on. So yeah, I think it's a really timely discussion. Would anyone like to add anything to that discussion, or shall I move on to the next question?
I feel that there's also a level of trust that's necessary for wellness, trust in self. So we're trust in self, and then by extension, trust in team and those that you're working with and for. So there's and that leads us onto a discussion about resilience and how we're building resilience kind of longer term in people. It's how do we connect people back in safety to themselves, to their bodies, to their emotions, to the way that they think and feel, and provide tools and mechanisms to enable people to continue to refresh that wellspring, I would say, of safe connection to self and others. So I think that's a very important part, and I really, really agree with Emily that it's not something that happens on its own. It is part of the community response. So as Gabriella said at the beginning, we can't really divorce the conversation of individual humanitarian wellness from the conversation around organizational or sector wellness, because those two things are really, really intimately connected. You can't put the responsibility solely on the individual to self-regulate, because you need the team around you to co-regulate. And I feel that that's the bigger picture that we're looking at here within this humanitarian sector, particularly within the issues for displaced people, is that we have, as a society, as a world, abrogated that responsibility. We've decided that we are not responsible for each other, that it's up to everybody individually to look after themselves. And I think that's part of the mess that we're in here. And the humanitarian aid sector, people are coming because they want to give that support. But the other side of that is not to forget yourself within that process. So it's constantly a two-way street.
Absolutely. And we knew that by separating or even attempting to separate individual and structural well-being, we knew that we were giving you all a very difficult task. But yeah, you're right. Of course, it can't actually be disentangled properly. I wonder then if we can talk a bit more about well-being in a specifically humanitarian sense. The second question is, what are some of the problems that you can identify when it comes to humanitarian wellness? And again, I'm aware that that's a very large question. Would you like to start us off again, Gabriella?
Yeah, sure. I was actually just gonna hop in, so that's perfect. And I think the last comment that Darren made kind of segues nicely into the response to that. So I, in the beginning, sort of talked about time allotment, and I'm just thinking back one of the weeks that I facilitated a wellness group for humanitarians, which was just a casual group who wanted to come together and just share their experiences with one another, because that is a unique perspective that I think humanitarians share and hold, and something that brings them close together. So one of the challenges is that we went through as a group was understanding how we allot our time and our relationships specifically. So one of the activities that we did was to make a relationships pie chart. So dividing up into 6 categories: myself, partner, friends, parents, coworkers, and refugees. We talked about what are the time allotments we spend in each of those categories, and is that where we want to be spending our energy? Because a common theme is that I think there's so much desire to give and address these huge world problems that really not one person can address. So giving a lot of time to our friends who are also kind of our coworkers, it's kind of hard to for humanitarians to sort of, I think, have, okay, like coming home at the end of the day and leaving a lot of hard things on their plate at work because maybe they're living, or their friends or their close partners are so entrenched just like them in humanitarian issues. And so there's secondary trauma stress. There's so many external factors that come into play that impact well-being, but it's also a lot to do with, I think, setting boundaries and the challenge that humanitarians have with doing that, because that was something that also came up in the group was like, we don't have this concept, humanitarians don't put this term refugees on people, they're just people. You know, they just experience life the same as anyone else, and they just consider them their friends. But at the same time, they're people who have gone through a tremendous amount of hardship that many of us can't even fathom to go, like what it's like to go through that. So I think the challenges that they face is sort of relating to people outside of their circle who don't have that same level of empathy or desire to make change in the world, and also kind of turning off in a healthy way to take care of themselves, the kinds of things that will help them just sort of relax and be aware of their own bodies, their own surroundings, and not be totally immersed in their field all the time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good start to that discussion, actually. And of course, I completely agree that I think it's something that people in the humanitarian sector do, or certainly should do, is simply seeing refugees as people rather than insisting on a given label. I do sometimes wonder if that can also lead in terms of humanitarian well-being, if that can maybe lead to some boundaries issues sometimes in terms of wanting to form these relationships with the people we work with, while also needing at some point during our week to actually have some boundaries as well. And I wonder if there's maybe a balance to strike there as well. Danny, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think I'm going to speak mostly about my own experiences. And yeah, for me, perhaps one of the greatest emotional difficulties or challenges is the difficulty of seeing like long-term changes, like the difficulty of being able to intervene at a big scale. For example, of public policies that affect the long term of the refugees. Not being able to influence at that level can cause frustration and also hopelessness. And also, sometimes I think it was difficult to deal with the frustration of the refugees, who sometimes see us also as part of the ones that are not really helping them, like to move on. And, yeah, and of course, sometimes they are also angry and frustrated, and you might be the one that like received that. It's also difficult because you are trying do your best, but it's also how can I say it, like I can understand that they feel that way. Yeah, and psychosocial interventions are interventions that may not have immediate effect. So many times you are like doing some tasks that sometimes you are not even like able to see the effect of that, the time that you are spending as a volunteer. So that is also something difficult, or it was difficult for me. I realized, because I was doing like very different tasks in the two organizations I was working, and I realized for me, even if I'm a psychologist, it was easier to do like concrete tasks, like to give food or to repair a house. That was easier for me because I could see like the effect, like the immediate effect. But also you realize that the psychosocial interventions sometimes are like even more important or as important, like to, I don't know, to keep different spaces for the refugees to have conversations or to learn something. Yeah, so it's difficult sometimes. And yeah, and also I was thinking about like maybe like material difficulties or more superficial, but I was thinking that when you are working as a as a volunteer in another country, you might also be worried about like no having income, or yeah, how to sustain your long term livelihood. Yeah, that thing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've probably all of us experienced that sense of powerlessness that you talk about, and also that feeling that meeting immediate material needs, at least you can perceive the effect it has. Whereas with psychosocial interventions, obviously we all know that they're hugely important, but often you can't see the immediate impact on a given individual, especially if it's more long-term interventions that you're doing. But equally, as you say, when people are, when someone is in desperate need of food or housing, they don't really have the time to be thinking about processing trauma or healing. So there's very much that hierarchy of needs there, isn't there? What are your thoughts on this, Darren?
Well, I'm guessing that we are mostly talking about the grassroots sector here, but I think we can extrapolate out into the wider humanitarian aid field. I think that there are many similarities, but the majority of the work that I know that I've done, and I think kind of reading the biographies of my fellow panelists, is that we've mostly been working in this grassroots sector. And I think there are some specific issues around that, which are very much to do with the kind of built from the ground up scrappy nature of grassroots organizations that have been started by people with big open hearts who really want to do something to help. And what that means is that there aren't necessarily the structures in place to support the well-being of team members, particularly volunteers who are coming in and out kind of in a shorter space of time. And in the work that I'm doing at the moment, what I notice is that most of the well-being thought or support is for service users rather than for service providers. And I think it's important for us to begin to recognize as a sector that there is no quality support for service users if we are not taking care of the well-being of our service providers at the same time. With that, I think, you know, as a trauma therapist, what I recognize and what I've recognized since 2015 when I started working in this sector is that many people who are attracted to work and volunteer within this field come with their own significant trauma history. So trauma often attracts other trauma. So what happens is that you're getting people with their own trauma load trying to work that out within a field where they need to be very seriously regulated before they can actually do effective work. So I think that's a massive issue there. Many of the people attracted to this field are young and inexperienced and don't necessarily have the life experience or regulating capacity to take care of themselves in very challenging situations, and within the interpersonal relationships that both of the other panelists have already talked about. You know, how do you reconcile listening to the stories every day of people who've been through very significant life experiences? How do you reconcile the helplessness that you have? how do you reconcile the hostility that there is at the moment towards humanitarian aid workers in places like the island of Greece? There are many life experiences that people are not prepared for, and there's no wraparound support to take care of that. I think also that there is, I think one of either Gabrielle or Daniela mentioned the time issue. There's not time, there's not resources available to really kind of look at things that might be coming up for individual team members. So that's big. And I think also just in general for the humanitarian aid world, there is a kind of macho culture, which is about, you know, getting on with it. And if you crumble, then there's something wrong with you. You have to be strong, you have to keep pushing through. And there's not enough real focus on people's feelings, the emotions that come up. Now, I say this a lot to the people that I train, is that this is not a space where there's no emotion. We have to create space to experience our emotions within safety, because we will be sad, we will be angry, we will be frustrated, we will be helpless. All of those things will come up. If we deny those feelings, that's when the overwhelm, and that's where the problems start to happen, and that's when things start to significantly affect the individual well-being of team members. So I think it's a cocktail of a whole load of different things, some of which are personal, some of which are systemic and sectoral. So there are similarities that pop up in every organization that I've worked with and I look at.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on one thing in particular that you said, which is that this is, is that our experience is biased towards the grassroots. And I think while that's true, we'd very much love to hear any thoughts that any of you may have about people working behind the front lines as well, because their contribution is crucial and it comes with its own challenges for maintaining kind of emotional well-being. So we're not specifically restricting the discussion to grassroots.
But just to add to that as well, I think also that there are different issues within the different contexts in which we're working. So there are different things to be thought about when you're working right in the crisis zone with people in refugee camps and kind of coming ashore from crossing the ocean, to when you might be working in a more settled environment and people are starting to process their asylum, to when people have got their asylum and then are starting to build their lives. So we look at that in the Human Hive as a spectrum of experience, and there's different needs required from grassroots or humanitarian aid organizations that are intersecting with those populations. And that also for me is about when and how you tackle trauma. Because, I agree with Daniela, a refugee camp is not necessarily a place to start to unpack and do therapeutic work. You can do work that has a therapeutic feeling to it. So I think, doing activities that are trauma informed are really important, but to actually dig into therapy, it's not the right place. People are still there in the trauma vortex. They're still moving. They're still in their fight-flight response a lot of the time. But what I find is that when you're working with people who are starting to settle, they're arriving in a country and they're staying, 3 to 6 months in is when the trauma really hits, and that's when you need to start to do those more kind of psychosocial or psychological interventions to support people with their mental health. So that's particularly for service users, but not necessarily. There are similar things going on, I think, for the people who are providing those services. Sorry, I just saw a hand go up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add something to that, that also, because I think if you ask also the refugees that are in camps, and yeah, they also, they don't want that in that moment. They want to to have some certainties first. Yeah, they can't start therapy. They need to be able to know where are they going to live first and how, and yeah.
Absolutely, thank you both. Emily, is there anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yes, thank you. Everything that everybody said there really resonated with some things that we're working here on in Athens. And so we've set up a project called the Pandora Project, which is focusing on basically volunteer and humanitarian aid worker well-being. And during our research, obviously, and collective time in the field with me and my team, we realized that, it can be broken into long-term and short-term with volunteers and humanitarian aid workers. You know, you might have somebody there for 2 months, you might have somebody there for 3 years. I would say that within the sort of the short-term area we're looking at here, lack of training and systematic support is the first red flag that I think we identified with regards to young, very open-hearted volunteers and people coming into Greece with absolutely no training whatsoever. In fact, in our pilot project, 100% of the 85 participants that we have been doing training with during their time here in Greece did not receive any training prior to coming to work in a refugee camp. So, you know, this is a huge problem because you're putting young, vulnerable, and inexperienced volunteers into the pit of the fire, and so the systematic support isn't there. It's just simply not there to look after them. So I'm not saying that young and vulnerable means they can't change the world, because they definitely are changing the world here in Greece, but I'd say that this is one of the biggest issues when it comes to humanitarian wellness here in this specific context. However, something I wanted to touch upon as well that Darren spoke about was about us having these emotions, you know, and these emotions should not be negated, because it is in fact why we are here, that we have these emotions are why we are here. These emotions are the thing that took us off our sofa in 2015, or took us out of our comfortable lives in 2016, you know, because we had these intense emotions. And so these emotions should be absolutely respected in the field, and often they're not. Another issue. Also, I feel that in an emergency setting, people in the humanitarian context, or leaders within a community, or volunteers or coordinators or NGO coordinators, are very good at casting aside their own well-being in order to put somebody ensuring the well-being of other people in front of them. In fact, they're experts at it. There's the metaphor, isn't there, of, you know, in the plane where you have to put on your own oxygen mask before helping somebody else. Well, this is what needs to happen, basically. And it's simply, I mean, it's starting slowly to happen, but just not quite enough. And you're not actually able to help if you're not supporting yourself in the first place anyway. Or maybe you are, but it's definitely not sustainable. Another issue that I came up with when I was thinking about this specific question was that self-awareness isn't really very common within humanitarian aid workers. Self-awareness and actually being aware of your own boundaries and limitations and being blind to them. So I'd say that this is probably because humanitarian aid workers spend most of their time being hyper aware of other people's emotional state, or physical state, or psychological state, and therefore there's almost like a wall built between them and the person themselves. I feel that the people in the field who would really benefit from this kind of support are often those who don't even consider it, or don't even know that it's available to them. And then linked into that, I say, I'm included in that statement. It took me a long time to understand that I needed support to be able to do the work that I'm doing. As in the humanitarian world, the burnout badge is also worn with quite a lot of pride, and self-care and taking a break is often really stigmatized as something that's weak, or it means you're not tough enough. If you're taking a break, you can't withstand this cycle, you know. This is a systematic stigma, which we must work to change, I feel, as a community. And this is the reason why the Pandora Project was set up in Athens. And I'm sure this is one of the reasons why the Human Hive was created, and one of the reasons why the Insight group came together in the first place. You know, it's about talking about this and advocating for it. And finally, my final point is that I feel that aid work can be extremely isolating. And one of the pillars of resilience is interpersonal connection and community, right? It's like social connection with people that you love and people that care for you. However, having had the experiences that you might have had in a refugee camp or a fire or anything like that, speaking about that, you feel like that can be a burden on other people. And therefore you slowly start distancing yourself emotionally and isolating yourself from the people that you need to be pulling close to you. And this in turn affects your emotional resilience in a negative way. So they were my 4 main points. I could go on for hours, but I'm not going to. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Those are some really good points there. This is entirely anecdotal, so it doesn't really answer your first point at all, but your first point about people simply not getting the training before they enter into the refugee context. I experienced that myself 13 years ago when I first started working with refugees. I went to a centre rather than a camp and worked there full-time for a year, and every single one of my colleagues dropped out early and burnt out because we received no training whatsoever. So I think that definitely predates the situation of the last several years. I've had a question sent to me privately in the chat. So I'm afraid none of you have had any forewarning about this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it because it's a really interesting question. And that question is there an issue around working with humanitarians around their own mental health because there are such different cultural perceptions of mental health and such different cultural perceptions of treatment for mental health as well? And they've specified they don't necessarily mean ethnic or national cultures, but cultures of all sorts, all kinds of communities having different perceptions of mental health, maybe different levels of stigma attached to it and so on. And rather than put any of you on the spot, since I didn't give you any warning, just any of you who have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear from. Just please do go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Go for it, Darren.
Let's go for it together. Come off mute and we can we can chip in. I'm sure we're going to say similar things. I think we should take away the emphasis on kind of therapy for when we're working in the field or when we're working within this sector. I think wellness and well-being is not necessarily to do with therapy. It is absolutely to do with mental health, but when we're working together, I'm interested in looking at behavior and supporting people when behaviors come up, rather than necessarily having to dig into people's histories or people's past. So we can take away a lot of the stigma around mental health issues if we take away the therapy part of it. And we talk much more about overwhelm. We talk about how, if you're a little bit sped up, if you've got a lot of energy in the body that needs to be released, or if you're a little bit shut down, or you don't have as much energy in the body. And then we can bring in wellbeing practices that support you to come back to a kind of a nice median space. So we can do things that energize, we can do things that relax. We're looking at kind of how interpersonal relationships are working within the space. And this is why I really advocate for there being someone who is a wellbeing coordinator for a team. So there's someone who has that training and that expertise and is looking out for the signs of this, and then they could be more of an intervention. But yes, I mean, that's kind of my stance about it. And then therapy is something that happens alongside and separate to what you're doing in your actually kind of work or in your work environment. You should be working in an environment that respects your well-being and your mental health, but you shouldn't necessarily be working through those issues as part of the work environment.
I would add to what Darren said by saying that I feel that the question of asking if it's difficult for humanitarian aid workers to access or to, advocate for themselves to have this mental health because of cultural differences. I feel at first we look at the individual and understand that every individual, whether they're a humanitarian aid worker, a resident volunteer, a community volunteer, or an international volunteer, every human is entirely intersectional from their own experiences, their own religion, their own culture, their own, wherever they come from and whatever they bring to the table. I think it's quite difficult to categorize how people perceive trauma due to the title of their job, because I feel that you could be sort of the recipient, or you can feel vicarious trauma, you can feel secondary trauma, you can feel primary trauma, no matter what you are or who you are or where you are. To link it to the humanitarian aid worker, we're talking about a community of people who have chosen to expose themselves to this context because they have hope in their ability to make a change. Now, maybe they sometimes, like I know I have done, maybe sometimes they have too much hope and they think that they can do it no matter what, and they don't need support because they've got all the hope they have, you know. But yeah, I think we're talking about, rather than it being just a humanitarian aid worker and their ability or inability to access mental health care, or what terminology was used in the question, it's very much dependent, I think, on the individual, because I come from the UK. I come from a family which is very open to mental health. My father's a psychiatrist, you know, but some people might have come from the UK, from the same town as me, but their whole family is shut down to looking after yourself or talking about your emotions. So I think we're talking about something that's hugely intersectional.
I think it comes back to something you said earlier about self-awareness, is that a lot of this is about how do we develop a sense of self-awareness within we're talking about the humanitarian aid sector, but I agree, it is intersectional, it's about the whole world. But if we can create a self-awareness of how your behaviors or feelings might be changing as a consequence of you being with this environment,
yeah.
That can support people to regulate themselves and reach out for the help that they need. And that comes back down to what we were talking about before: training and preparation before you enter the field, and then support while you're actually there, and then also support to transition out. So 3 main areas of how do you prepare yourself to enter, how do you look after yourself while you're doing it, and how do you support yourself to transition to another phase in your life. This
is the reason. One of our main practices in the Pandora project is a 3-part support system, which is onboarding, current, and offboarding for short-term volunteers, and all of them focus on awareness, you know. And it's also one thing that I've understood and realized over the years is that self-awareness is infectious. Other people see you taking steps for your own health or outwardly describing how something makes you feel, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, this is a safe space for me to be able to say something like that as well. I can feel this without being stigmatized because she's done it, you know. And so it's infectious. It has a domino effect, a positive domino effect.
Totally agree.
Thank you both. I'll move us on to our third question then. Before I do, we've had an article posted in the chat that's looking at the kind of dynamics of aid workers and the impact of emergency aid work on personal relationships. So you might find that interesting if you'd like to have a look at that. I'm also going to post Insight Collaborative social media links into the chat, because we have another webinar in 2 weeks about this topic in a structural sense, and we also have 2 webinars on other topics every month. So do follow our social media if you'd like to see more of these discussions. So our last question for today, we always try and end on a slightly more hopeful or optimistic note, although today's discussion has been significantly less doom and gloom than a lot of our discussions, which has been been very refreshing, so thank you all. So today our last question is, what are some solutions that can be implemented for individual humanitarian workers to protect and look after themselves? Gabriella, would you like to start us off with that?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, so I think a lot of things throughout the webinar have been said, and that's kind of what's been sort of hopefully keeping us on that more positive wavelength, because it is important to try and shine the light on positive things too in this sector, which is maybe we're all intuitively trying to do more of that. So I think, yeah, body awareness, life awareness. There's a lot of techniques to just, take 5 minutes. There's a lot of applications and resources out there that people can do. It's just about implementing them and making them an integral part of your everyday life. And then, so like, yeah, having body awareness about how you're feeling right now and keeping track of that. And then a life awareness, like what's happening in your life. How are you changing? How are you reacting to these changes internally? Can you track these changes? And then from an organizational perspective, having worked in like local NGOs and also at the big organizational level, like for huge organizations doing humanitarian work, it's definitely a challenge, but needs to be done of stopping this burnout culture, especially in bigger organizations where the structure is just overwhelming for everybody, and that is the culture, and it is sort of a macho thing. And then I think it also like subsequently impacts life at home and not being able to cope with the stresses of daily life in healthy ways, and leads to problems like drinking and other things that you see in the field that can affect us. And then, yeah, noticing if the things that we love no longer make us happy, that's a sign of secondary traumatic stress. It's a sign of things going sort of, maybe your work is taking a toll on you. And yeah, just I think it's important for organizations in general to make sure that their teams are well equipped, like saying that, Emily, that so many people in the field are not equipped and don't know the kinds of ways which humanitarian work can impact their lives, and preparing themselves for that kind of experience and checking up consistently on them in a way that shows that the organization really cares for them. I think it's actually pretty rare, which is surprising because humanitarian work is supposed to come from a place of taking care of others, which you can't do if your team is not taking care of themselves. So I think that would be my big overall message. I think some of the smaller NGOs I've worked with have a almost a healthier culture of taking care of one another because of the level of interaction that they have with one another, those sort of quality relationships, also less hierarchy, less competition. The organization make time for everyone to be on sort of the same page. So also by nature, the size of smaller organizations can really, bigger organizations can take a few notes from them and how they function, I think. So yeah, I'll end it there.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Yes, I think you're absolutely right to mention those kind of structural issues as well, because this is probably where it's hardest to disentangle the two, just because so many solutions to individual well-being have to be structural by necessity. Yeah, still good to look at it from the individual perspective as well. So thank you. Danny, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, yes, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe the things I thought about are like more about humanitarian workers working in another place, like maybe short term, I would say like month. So about that, I believe that first, it is important that organizations are as explicit and as up to date as possible regarding the task they're doing, or the task in which the volunteers will be involved. Because this might be very like obvious, but sometimes also when the organizations are like from another country, they don't have sometimes the information like up to date, like in English for everybody, because they are changing also, and they're changing the task they need to do. So I think that is first very important. So you as a volunteer know exactly what you are supposed to do, what you are going to do. Also, I think is maybe a way to like care for volunteers, that they are able to choose some of the tasks they are going to do, or maybe to choose one task in which they don't want to be involved. I remember that was like something I really appreciate about Salam, in which you could choose what you really want to do, or also maybe sometimes to start a new project if possible. I think that's very good. Yeah, maybe this sounds like obvious, but also if possible to ensure some materials conditions, like that the place that you're living is comfortable, or yeah, like they respect each other, to be able to rest. And also I think that it's very important to provide some leisure activities, or like team activities, that you feel part of the group, that you are able to know each other, because that makes the experience very, very different. So this could be something very simple, like to have, I don't know, like a movie night, or one day to eat everybody together, and that's very important, because you feel part of the group, and so you don't feel so lonely or so isolated anymore. So yeah, so maybe those could be some things to like provide.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important, that feeling of social connection with your colleagues and your peers, and that feeling of being able to build up the team and take care of those other kind of life issues outside of your work. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Darren, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't have a huge amount to add, because I think that both of the previous panelists have really covered a lot, and we've talked about it through the course of this webinar. I do think that those three important points that both Emily and I talked about are important to take care of: the preparation, care out in the field, and then the debrief and transition back into everyday life. I think that it's important that there's somebody that's looking out and has awareness with an outside perspective. It's very easy when you get into these very intense situations to lose perspective, and to lose a feeling of what's normal and what's not normal in terms of your feelings or your behaviors or how you're interacting with others. So I often call this person like an anchor person, that there's somebody there who has more experience, or who maybe isn't actually totally in the same setting as you, but that you can check in with and will be able to see those things. So that I think what we all want to do is prevent burnout and prevent that feeling of secondary trauma, or the collapse that happens when people don't recognize their own overwhelm. So as long as, if we are as individuals and as teams and organizations, that we're constantly checking into the well-being of the individuals, we're making sure that people are having fun and enjoyable activities, we're making sure people feel purposeful, we're making sure that people are not getting overwhelmed, we're making sure that people are in the right tasks for them, all of those things that have already been discussed. But it's not so easy for the individual to notice that for themselves. So I think that's a really key thing. And I know we're talking about this from the personal perspective, and training will allow people to recognize the activities and tools that they need to bring to themselves to manage their own particular version of overwhelm. That's really important for the individual's responsibility, but we can't just leave it to the individual. And I think that is where we've got to in the sector in general, whether it's grassroots or larger humanitarian or the bigger world, is that it's up to you. It's all up to you to look after yourself. And if something goes wrong, it's kind of your fault because you haven't looked after yourself well enough. We have to ensure that we are observing and helping and supporting people to do that all the time, because you lose that view on yourself, that perspective on yourself. So that's what I would add to this discussion.
Absolutely, and I think that can still be related to the personal as well, simply by saying that as well as looking after ourselves and as well as there being structural solutions, it's also really important for colleagues to look out for each other. The best organisations that I've worked in have been those where team members have looked out for each other, and where that kind of culture of mutual support, rather than in certain toxic environments, mutual competition, is fostered. What are your thoughts on this, Emily?
So yeah, I would say the kingpin is with regards to personal, individual humanitarian aid workers. I'd say that the kingpin is developing self-awareness, because as soon as you've got that, you've identified something, or you're able to. At least you have the toolkit to identify something. So after self-awareness, I would say that, you've got this identification of any arising issues, or if there are any. And then I would say that the next point is acceptance of them, because, it's always something that's always missed. Like you feel, oh, I'm feeling like this, but I need to just ignore it and carry on. The hardest bit is actually the acceptance that this is something that's going wrong, or something that doesn't sit well. And I think within that acceptance, you can then be empowered to pull in support or develop your toolkit. I think that pulling in support when it's needed and understanding that that decision and self-awareness is a tool in itself is extremely empowering. In order to bolster this process, the maintenance of truthful, positive relationship with people, because you have to pull in support from somewhere, right? Whether that's a therapist or loved ones or friends, or discussing something with friends and them saying, Emily, I think you might need to see someone more professional. That's happened to me before, and it's fine, and it's empowered me. Also, a big shout out to an organization I'd like to say is ESD Global. They run a fantastic course on personal and professional boundaries for aid workers and people on the front line. And this was extremely empowering for me and extremely eye-opening for me, because it was about understanding what my boundary is personally and professionally. And it changed my whole perception of who I was in the workplace. And it made me much more resilient to the constant kind of things coming into my space, And finally, I would say, like, with a bit of time and experience in the field, you can focus on building and developing your own personal toolbox or toolkit, which I know Darren's team has been working on, because I attended a few of the webinars during the first lockdown, and they were fantastic. So this would be focusing on how you manage situations, how you react to them afterwards, and what you do within that environment, like breathing techniques, all of these kind of things. And everybody's toolkit is different. And I think it's about identifying what it is that makes you feel grounded and happy, and doing that. Like, that's it. What is it that makes you feel connected and cuddled by the world, and these things are really important. And also, everyone's personal life is sacred, and it should be treated as sacred by yourself, and the workplace should be something that's encroached upon. They're the points I came up with.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I completely agree with you, of course, on the importance of connection and supporting those around you as well. I think that brings us to the end of our questions, but before we close, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, and I'd just like to ask as well if any of you have any last words or thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before we finish up. Go ahead.
So I'd like to say that I think that the most important thing that we carry as humanitarian aid workers and helpers and volunteers is hope. I think we enter this field with a huge amount of hope that we're going to be able to change something, or not change the world, but change somebody's world, And so I think it's with hope that sometimes it's all we've got, and I think we can always be sure that we can be armed with this in any situation, because it's a choice. We can choose to have hope. So to any volunteers or humanitarian aid workers that feel like there's no hope, there always is. There's always hope. And thank you to Insight and everybody here for sharing your knowledge and time and compassion. It's been really inspiring.
Thank you, Emily. That's lovely. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to say?
I think, how could everybody counter hope? I think that's a wonderful way to leave things. I think all I was going to say was that for anyone who's listening who is volunteering or working in this field is to be kind to yourself. And maybe that connects very much with what Emily just said around hope. So hope that you can make a difference, but also be kind to yourself that maybe you can't do that as quickly as you would like.
Thank you. Yes, very much so. Very important. Danielle, Gabriella, is there anything you'd like to add? No worries if not, no pressure. I just I don't want to cut you off.
No, I just want to thank you for this invitation and this space, and to apologize also for my English, but it was really nice to be here and talk with each other.
No need to apologize at all, Daniel. We've really appreciated having your perspective.
Yes, similarly to Daniela, just thank you for the opportunity to have a conversation around such a really important topic, especially as hopefully the world is sort of waking up to the importance of mental health and how it's really important in every field, but especially this sector. So thank you for the space.
Oh, thank you all very much for joining this space and lending us your expertise. We'll be uploading this to YouTube either later this evening or tomorrow morning. So for anyone who did have to miss the discussion, then they can go to our YouTube channel to catch it. And as I said earlier, we'll be having another discussion on this topic in 2 weeks. So do tune in then as well if this is a topic that interests you. And yeah, thank you again, everyone. And I hope to see you all soon.